So we now move on to our second order of business for today, examining how the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which I'm going to refer to them as DCMS from now on, is handling repayments of COVID-19 loans. Between October 2020 and March 2022, the department lent $474 million to 120 borrowers operating in the culture and sports sector to help them survive the dreadful COVID-19 pandemic. This support was provided in the form of loans, repayable for up to 25 years, and this is the first time that DCMS has managed such a significant loan book. And as of October 24, just under half of borrowers had started repaying their loans, and DCMS had achieved 41 million of repayments. 9 borrowers had become insolvent, covering loans of 46 million. So today, therefore, we will be examining DCMS's approach to establishing and managing this loan book, as well as what the future emerging risks for the loan book might be. So to help us with all that, we're delighted to have today the Permanent Secretary, the new Permanent Secretary, well, not so new now, Susannah Storey, who was appointed Permanent Secretary in the Department in June 23. Welcome, Susannah.
Thank you.
We also have with us on my left, Polly Payne, Director General for Policy. Polly became Director General for Policy at DCMS in a job share with Ruth Hannant in July 2023. Not quite sure how you tossed the coin to see which of you came today. You drew
the lucky recipient.
You drew the short straw, Polly, anyway, I'm sure. And finally, we have Nicola Hewer, Director of Visitor Economy, Heritage Loans and Art Collections. Nicola is the DCMS Loan Book's Senior Responsible Owner. So particularly warm welcome to you, Nicola, because it is your first visit to the committee. So, without any further ado, we move on to the first question. And the first question is from Chris Payne, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. You've had to set this whole process up. Go back to COVID, a very chaotic time. You had to make decisions. It's got to be commended what all of us had to do right back at the start of this. But as we go through this, we'll talk about establishing the loan book. We'll take you through it. But the decision-making process started in a very chaotic place. But you've taken decisions, and you continue to take decisions that are, I'm not going to say unique, but they're certainly there are different paths you could have taken. So I suppose where we are in the process looking back, given how it started, given you had to make tough decisions, but given that you've then got a knock-on effect of the decisions thereafter, if you had to do this again, what would you do differently? That's probably to the Permanent Secretary.
Thank you so much. Chair, would you mind, just before I answer that question, if I just reminded the committee that I have a declared conflict in relation to rugby union? I know we've talked about it before, but I just wanted to make sure the committee...
No, that's perfectly in order. Please,
Thank you very much.
Do that. That's on the record.
Thank you.
And we are very conscious of the fact that any questions on rugby will not be directed at you, will be directed at your colleagues.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, sorry, coming back to your question. Yes, you're absolutely right. I think, us preparing for this hearing has, and all the work with the NAO, for which many thanks, I think has reminded us, just how it did feel in COVID, as you say, that at the time, particularly in 2020, so many of our sectors and right across the country and society, people were facing uncertainty and unknown factors. And it was in that context that the department took the decisions as part of a series of interventions, both, of course, the pan-economy interventions, but also here some sector-specific interventions. The department took some decisions as part of that to provide some of the support as loans, and that, of course, is the subject of this hearing. And we have a closed loan book that the NAO has described as having some fairly unique features. And I think we reflect, actually, that given the time at which the loans were put in place and the context, in fact, the objectives were clear and the decision-making has always been clear. And as you know, our objectives for this loan book are first the financial objective and second the policy objective. So I think we feel that over time we have made some improvements, but we're in a relatively solid place. And as the Chair has said, we've now started to see the first repayments. Of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing. We've tried to build in lessons learnt as we've gone through this process. And as I said to the Chair in my letter last week, we have just completed some further lessons lessons learned. I guess my hindsight would be we perhaps were a bit optimistic in the business case about the number of staff in our team looking after this loan book, because it does have these relatively unique characteristics. And there were one or two places that the NAO helpfully highlights where I think we were had a bit of optimism bias on our timelines. So, for example, we changed the scope of the loan management system. So there were one or two things, but I do think overall it was a helpful intervention. The evaluation published in relation to the CRF and the sports survival package both made clear that these were broadly effective interventions. And as I'm sure we'll discuss, we were quite careful at the time that the loans were given to have some specific due diligence on the borrowers. So we did know who they were, and as a result of that, for example, the evaluation showed that the fraud levels have been relatively low. So long way of saying, we've definitely learnt some lessons, we've definitely made some improvements as we've codified this process, but I think with hindsight it was a relatively solid intervention.
You wouldn't change much?
I think never say never, and I think what we've really tried to do over the last year in particular is we've clarified our governance, we've codified our processes, we've increased the resource on the team. Nicola is now the dedicated SRO. We've really tried to make sure that with the loan agents, everybody knows clearly what their responsibilities are. So I think it's been a process of kind of consolidation, I would say. And I think we are now in a solid place as we go into the year where, as you know, we're going to start seeing more and more of the repayments because the repayment holidays are coming to an end.
So I'm so surprised to that, because reading the report comes all the way through that there's a lot that could have been done differently and a lot that still could be done differently. But it would be your assertion that no, you're quite comfortable, other than tweaking around the edges of it. Most of the decisions solid, and you would go back and do it again.
It's really hard, isn't it, to say exactly what one would do if one did do it again, and also what the counterfactual would be if we had done it differently.
I'm just asking you to clarify. That's what I'm hearing you're saying.
Yeah, I've come to the loan book when I took the accounting officer role in the summer of 2023. And having looked at it then and continued to look at the changes that we've been making, consistent with the NAO's recommendations, actually, I think we're in a solid place, and we've got a good set of procedures. And given that these are loans where we need to get the money back, I think we are in a reasonable position. Now, I absolutely agree with the NAO's recommendations, and I'm looking forward to the recommendations from this committee and to our discussion today. And of course, there's always things that one might do more of, but across the core areas of the objectives of the scheme, its governance, the expertise that we now have, yes, I do think we're in a solid place.
Okay, I'm getting a couple of specific points. I suppose with you coming in after it had started, even when hindsight's a wonderful thing, but a fresh pair of eyes is a wonderful thing. You looking in 2 years into the process, you're still comfortable. It was everything was fine. Nothing you would change. It's just the way you're presenting the answer is not what comes across from the report, and I think I get the impression that that's not what you're going to get from the committee. So maybe that's an observation rather than a question. So let me ask you a couple of questions. One of the things that comes out of the report is that you could have drawn more on the learning from across government, given government's experience of managing loans during the pandemic. Why didn't you draw more on that learning of other departments of government?
We did draw from other departments, and my understanding is that at the time we talked to the Treasury, UKGI, and obviously the BBB, because there were some other loan schemes, different in nature, but there were some other loan schemes at the time in COVID. And then what we have sought to do over time is make sure we've got that external representation in our programme. So on the Loans Advisory Board now, which the DG's chair, we have external expertise, including from the British Business Bank. So we have absolutely sought to do that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Polly, on that.
So I think a few things. I mean, really big picture. As Susannah said, there's no particular characteristic of this loan book which is unique, but it's a unique set of characteristics. So we talked, as Susannah said, to HMT, UKGI. We also talked to the British Business Bank. We also talked to Bays, who do obviously student loans, which are very different, but another loan book. And we also talked to, within the department, we had run a loans under future builders, but also we do give some loans to our museums and galleries anyway as normal business rather than as COVID. So we learnt from all of those. I'm sure we could have done more, but as you'll all remember, it was a time where there was so much being done in kind of very new circumstances, and I'm sure we could have done better, but I think we did talk to those different bodies. And I think the other thing to say is we did discuss with both UKGI and BBB whether they thought they were better placed to do the loan management of the book once we had the book, and we agreed with them, they agreed with us, that it was better for DCMS to remain looking after and managing the loan book for various reasons, which I can discuss.
Polly, in terms of the interest rate itself, why did you offer such favourable terms for the loans? You know, the 2% simple interest rate over the whole loan period. I'd like to know why that was done, but also that sounds to me like on a period of reflection that could have been done differently. That's maybe a learning lesson.
Well, I think firstly these loans were deliberately not on commercial terms. They were given to people who couldn't get commercial loans at the time. So we weren't approaching it with a commercial lender's hat on. The 2% was the Public Works Loan Board rate at the time, and we felt that a flat rate would give certainty and simplicity of administration. And I think we were also very conscious there were a number of our borrowers who hadn't had loans, especially from government, and of this kind of 25-year nature before. So we were very keen to make it something that they would feel comfortable with. I think also that we did make exceptions. So, for instance, in particular on CRF, there were two exceptions where we had more commercial borrowers, where the rates were more up towards 7%. And so I suppose for all those reasons, we felt 2% was right.
Okay, thank you. Permanent Secretary, what assessment have you made of the risks of managing this loan book in isolation?
Yeah, I mean, we have sought to ensure that our risk mindset is built into the programme throughout, and also, of course, into our oversight of it as a department. So, as Polly said at the time in the beginning, it was a novel thing for the department to do, so we did seek expertise on how to set it up and try and make sure that we were setting it up mindful of that expertise. The way we run it now is there's risk ratings, which Nicola might want to talk through, in all of the interface with the borrowers and in the decision making, both when the loan agents are interfacing with the borrowers, but also when the department is considering different issues. And then the loan book itself comes into the departmental risk environment. So obviously we have our Delivery and Risk Committee, which is our main oversight committee that reports into my executive board. And if Nicola, as SRO, felt that the risk profile was changing for the programme or for a particular issue, she would make sure that that was coming into our governance. So we seek to make sure that risk is absolutely integral to everything that we do.
Would it not be more efficient to consolidate the DCMS loan book with others across government?
This is one of the things I'm sure that we'll talk about, because I know that the NAO have said in their report that they think we should do more on the sort of long-term strategic options, and that absolutely is something that we're keen to do once the book gets to steady state and everybody is repaying later on this year. I mean, my observation would be that it could be more efficient to do that if our loan book and some of those other loan books had sufficient similarity of features that there was a kind of economy of scale or economy of function. But I suppose the thing that may play against that when we come to do that options assessment is that, as the NAO have said, this closed loan book does have some particular features, and the nature of the borrowers, as Polly was saying. Many of these entities at the time, we were the lender of last resort. They're not used to having borrowing in their capital structure, and so I think we would need to make sure that if that was an option that was to be considered, the kind of benefits outweighed the risks, to your point. And I think at this stage what we've been seeking to do is make sure we've got this really thorough oversight, and we feel the risks are being well managed as the book gets to steady state. And I think there's a helpful chart in the NAO's report that shows, in these early years as we finish the repayment holiday, we're getting to the point where we're getting interest and ultimately capital from all the borrowers. But over time, of course, that profile's down. And as you know, the loans, some of them are for up to 25 years. So it may be that in due course that does make sense. But as at today, I don't think we think there is another lender in government where it would neatly slot in. But as I say, we'll come back to that when we look in more detail. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, Nicola?
No, I think you've covered everything. Exactly, it's something to look at for the future.
Okay. And then last one from me at the moment, the report sort of does mention or does look into that by managing the loan book in isolation, how it fits in with the government's portfolio of financial assets is not quite as clear as it could be. So how does DCMS loan book fit in from your perspective as part of the government's overall asset portfolio?
Yeah, so from a DCMS perspective, obviously we report on it every year in our report and accounts, and we have the expected credit loss sort of asset value, which is amortised in our accounts. So that's the way the asset kind of fits into the DCMS accounts, which fit into the wider government accounts. I think one of the things we will want to do when we get into our strategic options appraisal, and sorry to sort of give you a window into the future, which is obviously something I'll have to come back on in due course, but when we're thinking about the next spending review and beyond, of course, we want to make sure if there is a better way of doing it, or if there's a better way to classify this asset for the Treasury, that we think about that. But at the moment, it basically sits with us and on our accounts.
And just a final point from each of that point about doing the thinking about where it fits in with it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the timescale for that? Because I think certainly to me and I know others, it feels like that should be something you're doing right now. It feels like understanding how it fits in strategically is something that work should have been done already. So when will it be done, and when will we get that sense from you?
Yeah. We will be doing a further evaluation in the first quarter of this year, and then looking at the strategic options later on this financial year, so the one from April 2025 to March 2026. And the reason why we haven't done it before is firstly because we wanted to be sure that we had this solid operating model, we had all the procedures, we codified what we needed to, and we had the right capability and capacity in our team doing the oversight. Secondly, this year we will be starting the repayments from all the borrowers who haven't yet repaid, and so we expect it to be quite a busy year in that regard. And then once we've got a track record of the borrowers repaying, we think that is the right time to look at strategic options, because sometimes, as you know, when you're considering complex strategic options, you can do sort of scenario planning, but actually having the track record is the thing that will make that strategic option review more insightful, we think.
And last question from me, I just want to go back to my first question. If you had to do this all again, based on your answers over the last 10 minutes, is there anything you want to update that would you do anything differently?
No, as I say, we've always been mindful of the lessons from others. There was obviously a PAC hearing in 2021, which was clear that the committee had some concerns at that point about the size of our team. So we've actually increased our team quite significantly, and we now have, I think, 15 people, Nicola, in your team. We've been careful to codify our processes and governance. And so given that we had this loan scheme, I feel that we have managed it in a solid and effective way.
Thank you very much, Chris Kane. Luke Charteris, please.
Thank you. Do you acknowledge that at its heart, I think you do, that there's a great paradox here between the policy objective and the financial objective? The policy objective being you wanted to ensure the survivability of these institutions, the financial objective being you wanted to recoup the capital and interest for the taxpayer. But that means that you are constrained in things like how you manage the loan book, as we'll come on to. Do you acknowledge that there's a central paradox between, or a conflict, a tension between those two objectives?
We often find in government that we have tension between objectives, and I do think that the way we've been clear about the financial objective being the primary objective, but then, as you say, in certain circumstances, of course, we need to consider the policy objective. And they could be in tension, but that's why we try and make sure we've got very clear protocol for decision-making and escalation, should it be necessary, in those kind of situations. But it's not unusual, in my experience, in different things that the government does, that those two things pull in different directions. Obviously, with my accounting officer hat on, I'm very focused on that financial objective. But as you say, at the time in COVID, really, I think the government was trying to ensure that the sectors and these particular sectors could survive and remain viable. But not every entity in the sectors was given a loan or a grant at the time in the Sports Survival Package or the Cultural Recovery Fund.
I think it's an important admission that you recognise that there is a conflict and okay, I would have hoped for a greater recognition, and it builds on my colleague's point that really there's a risk here that there was a conflict of interest at the heart of the whole scheme, that you have this tension between wanting to ensure the survivability of these firms but then actually running the loan book until its maturity. Just to give you one final chance before we move on and get into the substance of the session, looking back, do you feel as though there should have been some sort of independence between implementing the design of the loan book and then running the loan book down? Do you think ultimately, if you were to look back, you should have had an environment where DCMS set the policy and the parameters, and then actually another part of government ran the loan book down?
I don't think that's necessary, so long as the objectives are specific and clear, which in this case they are. And in 2020, 2021, when this was being set up, both the Cultural Recovery Fund and the Sports Survival Package had independent boards who were considering each case where a loan was granted. And then, as you know, we consolidated the loan book to ensure we had one set of decision-making with clear objectives. So I think it is manageable. And in Arts Council England and Sport England, who are the loan agents, they have discrete teams handling the relationships with the borrowers. I mean, the NAO does note in their report there is, of course, always a risk of borrower advocacy. And as you say, everything is in a wider environment. But I don't think it's unmanageable. I don't know, Polly, if you want to add anything, or Nicola, because you live at the front line of this.
So I think it's worth saying there was a bit of a shift between when we were giving the loans and grants out, in this case particularly we're talking about the loans, and when we were when they had been given out and we were managing the loan book. So when they were being given out, it was during COVID, and ensuring the sustainability of the sector, as Susannah said, during that time was our primary objective, and our secondary objective was doing it at minimum expense to the taxpayer. When we moved to managing the loan book itself, the loans having been given out, us not giving any more out, we were very clear that our primary objective was to take this loan book and to maximise its financial return. But we were cognizant that there might be a point at which, for the wider kind of sustainability objective that DCMS has always had for the sectors, that we might want to, and it was totally within ministers' decision-making options, to sometimes with particular decisions to take that tension and to do something that wasn't possibly in the main financial option, but the policy that was good from a policy point of view. That actually hasn't happened. Or so far we have run the loan book entirely. Well, the option's been there for us to do that. So far ministers have always made decisions where the financial objective has been followed throughout all their decision making.
Just to close that off for now, you know, God forbid there's ever another pandemic or a situation which the department would ever have to loan money out on an emergency basis. I get that money needs to get out the door, but would you not in future design a system whereby as soon as the money's out the door, there's then an independent branch of government to take on the management of the loan book to minimise those risks of borrower advocacy?
Go ahead.
I wouldn't do that. No, I think if it was more efficient to if we had hypothetical loan book, but for some reason was more efficient to be run in another bit of government, absolutely we should look at that, and we will continue to look at that. But I think I think we're, Susannah says, in all our careers we're quite used to trading off policy and financial objectives and doing things in the best way for the taxpayer, and that's an absolute standard bit of what we do. So I wouldn't see that by definition that should be done somewhere else. No.
I think that's quite an powerful learning for us to discuss, because from my perspective there are lessons learned about a more efficacious model in future scenarios. But with that, I'll pass back on to the Chair.
And obviously we are very interested to hear your thoughts as we go through.
So I'm going to follow Mr. Charteris's excellent question here, because I see that you are sensitive about whether it's a conflict of interest or a tension. And I think this, whether it's a tension or a conflict of interest, will get worse going forward, because I suspect there will be more organisations that go bankrupt. I suspect there will be more organisations that won't pay their loans at all or on time. And let me give you two specific examples where I think there may be a conflict of interest. And it's this. Whether it's the Arts Council or Sporting, they will have teams that deal with a particular organisation on a day-to-day basis and will be desperately keen that that organisation continues. There will be another part of that organisation that deals with the finances of these loans. And when it comes to making very difficult decisions about whether you should alter the terms of the loan, whether they should be pressed harder to repay at a particular point, whether you are going to make them bankrupt or not, I don't know whether any of those 9 you've actually made them bankrupt or whether they've voluntarily declared themselves insolvent. These are difficult conflict situations, and I wonder whether both, and it's no criticisms of the organisations, but it's just the situation they find themselves in. I wonder whether both Sports England and the Arts Council are party pre. They have a vested interest in this whole matter, and I'm wondering whether that will affect the long-term management of this COVID loan book.
We have not had that sense from them, and we've all spent time with them. Well, I think it goes to Polly's point in my experience. The financial objective of maximising the return to the exchequer is the primary objective for this loan scheme, and the individuals in both teams and in our own team who are responsible for that is their day-to-day responsibility. And as you say, you never want to see an insolvency, but it is feasible it could happen, at which case we will follow the protocol. So it is difficult in reality in government when resources are all limited to say let's put it in a different place or get a different third party to do it. And my understanding is that through the pandemic we did look at alternatives. The decisions were made by ministers for us to do it, and we do think it is manageable for us to deal with this.
Yes, but that wasn't quite my question. I understand why you did it at the time, because, as you say, there was an awful lot going on.
Yeah.
I think what the question was the thought going forward, whether this is a model that will actually be effective going forward.
I think we feel reasonably confident about that, having spent the time increasing the capability and capacity of the team, working with the loan agents on all of the respective roles and responsibilities. To your colleague's question earlier, making sure that risk is built into the way we look at this. So I think we feel cautiously optimistic about that. And also, Nicola might want to talk about it, because we're going into this repayment year, we seek to make sure we have a good line of sight to where the borrowers are well before we hit the repayment dates. And of course, as you will know, with all borrowers, there's a number of different things, covenants and other ways in which we get a bit of a line of sight to what's happening. And we do have a good degree of financial information for those borrowers. So I think we feel that the model is sufficiently robust. But I don't know if you want to add anything, Nicola?
Just to add to what Susannah said, I would say that in my dealings with the loan agents to date, I think they do understand and have sort of internalised sort of our primacy around the financial objective. They don't have a direct funding relationship with all or even necessarily the majority of borrowers in either the sports or the culture portfolio. And I think they understand that sort of tension that we are trading off, and they are giving us their best possible advice, but they also recognise ultimately that decision-making rests with the department, and they are sort of equipped to give us their best advice to help us make that decision.
I think the point Nicola made at the end there is really important. So we've put in 2 safeguards for exactly the problem you've identified. which is about the culture of Sport England and the Arts Council, isn't it? One safeguard is that we have these discrete teams that Susannah mentioned. So very clearly we have a discrete team and their job, and they are full of chartered accountants and professionals who are absolutely, that is their job to maximise the return for the taxpayer. But the second thing is we've been absolutely clear in all our documentation and all our agreements and all our delegations that any decision where anything is done which isn't in pursuit of the financial objectives. If you were going to in any way make a decision that was had a policy slant to it, then that has to come to DCMS and it has to go to ministers. Only ministers can decide to make that trade-off. So we've been very, very clear throughout, and it's in all our documentation, and I think that it's very clear to both our loan agents that is the case.
Thank you for that clarification. Could one of you saw there was a slight hesitation in my question. Can you just clear up for me, of those 9 organisations that have gone into insolvency mentioned in the NAO report, were they all voluntary insolvencies?
I'll take that, Polly.
When you say voluntary...
Well, was it your actions that put them into insolvency, or was it their actions?
It was not our actions.
No.
That were primarily the reason they went into insolvency, and with the Premier Rugby clubs, none of them had even gone into repayment. The 3 who have gone insolvent hadn't gone into repayment at the point they went insolvent, so it wasn't even a result of them having paid our loans.
So if it's clear that they haven't got a long-term financial future and they start defaulting on their loans, would you actually initiate insolvency procedures? Because often taking action sooner rather than later saves a lot of pain.
I don't think we'd probably come at it with a blanket rule like that. I think we would look at any decision around when there was a possible insolvency situation to think, how do we maximise the money for the taxpayer? And that could be by giving them a bit of breathing space so they can get back into a sensible position. It could be that we needed to absolutely maximise our legal rights, and we would take the decision case by case, and I really wouldn't want to prejudge it.
Fair enough. I see Luke jumped.
But ultimately, just to be clear, if it came to it, you would put one of these borrowers into insolvency.
If we thought that would maximise the financial return, and we had looked at any policy reasons for not doing that, which would probably be not only about the individual organisation, but also...
Ultimately, it was about the financial policy yielding preference. This is really important, this question, because if you're not willing to put these borrowers as the final fail-safe to the taxpayer, then these are not loans, they're grants. No, this is ultimately of importance to the committee.
Yeah, completely understand. So, and my answer was that yes, we would do that, except if there was a policy reason, in which case we would go to ministers, and it would be for ministers to make that decision. So it would basically be for ministers to decide whether it was a good use of taxpayers' money, as you say, more like a grant situation, to have this particular organisation continuing. And I think that would, when we gave that advice to ministers, it would depend on the individual organisation, but also their impact on the wider sport or cultural area that they're involved in. So, for instance, if you had an organisation which was, and I'm slightly making this up, but for instance, if you had a cultural organisation which was in a area that was a cold spot for cultural activities otherwise, it might be something that ministers thought was a good use of taxpayers' money to give a subsidy to, and they would have to make that decision.
I'm hearing a bit of fuzziness in this answer. Permanent Secretary, you have well laid down duties of managing public money. If you felt that the financial obligation was to put somebody into insolvency, but ministers decided otherwise on policy, on sporting or artistic grounds, would you seek a ministerial direction?
In that conceptual example, maybe I would, and it's exactly what I was thinking about when Polly was talking. I think what we're saying is, when you go through the processes set out in these loans, it is absolutely essential that any of these borrowers who has the legal undertaking to us as the lender appreciates that if they were in that situation, we wouldn't hesitate to use all of the financial levers we had. And as you know, in some cases we have security and so on. I think what Polly is saying is that's one route, the end of it. There is, as we we've already discussed, though, also a policy objective. If we were in this conceptual situation where, notwithstanding all of those primary financial objectives, we then reached the point in the decision tree where there was a decision in relation to policy, it may be in that case my obligations as accounting officer would require me to do exactly that, and I wouldn't hesitate to do it. But as Polly said, so far we haven't had any of those situations. And also it is important, I think, to remember that of the both loan books as originally conceived, of course the Cultural Recovery Fund loans are slightly smaller in number and larger in size. Many of the sports loans are really very small, and some have been repaid early. There's no particular reason to assume that an insolvency event would mean that policy objective would be triggered. So I think it is really important to be clear about that.
That wasn't the question that either of us were asking. The policy objectives failing. We were asking about the mechanics of whether you would do it. But thank you. You've clarified for me, at any rate, as chair, and hopefully my colleagues, what course of action you would take. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hewer, I'm looking at figure 12 in the report, and it appears to show that no costs have been forecast for any financial year after this one. Is that an actual reflection of your expectations, or is there another reason why there hasn't been any cost forecast?
So in our business case, we did detailed forecasts for the current spending review. We haven't yet done sort of the same level of detailed forecast for the subsequent years. In the business case, there was more sort of technical adjustment so that we could work out the overall sort of cost-benefit ratio of the different models that we were considering. But we expect to do those more detailed costings as part of the sort of strategic future work that the Permanent Secretary referred to.
So when will we have those forecasts for future years?
So we expect to do that work in this coming financial year, so by the end of April 26. March 26, sorry.
Would you mind if I just clarify one thing? Obviously, as Nicola says, the business case was done a couple of years ago for that spending review. As you know, we're now in a position where we've been given our spending settlement to March 2026, and in the department we're just in the process of undertaking our business planning for the next year. So we have an expectation of the costs of running the scheme for the year to March 2026. But for the years after that, that will have to be part of our spending review settlement to the Treasury. I appreciate that's a slightly different point from your point about forecasting out, but just in terms of the money, that's something that we'll be doing in the spending review.
So far you've spent 17.3 million. The total expected income of interest on the loans is 78 million. So you've spent 22% so far of that expected income. We know that 9 organisations have gone insolvent. We know there's a further 9 that are behind with their repayments. So how are you modelling, if you don't have yet an expectation of future costs, how are you modelling the expected balance of costs against income in future years?
Yeah, there's two things I'd say to that, and colleagues might want to add. I think the first thing to say is we were clear in the original business case that we expected the run rate of oversight costs to be roughly £5 million a year. As you say in the NAO report, they talked about 17.3, which was our forecast to March 2025. In practice, we've slightly underspent in this year, so I think we'll be at 16.7, 16, something like that. So the first thing to say is we are expecting that the one-off costs for some of the things included in the NAO report, such as the loan management system, have been slightly higher than they will be going forward. So what we'll be seeking to do as we do our strategic review work is look at some probably scenario-based run rate for managing this scheme based on the things that I have said. Our capacity and capability of this team, we're roughly 15 people at the moment, and we know the size of the loan agents' teams. Roughly, we will have a track record of experience of the loan management system, so we will have the costs of that, and that's how we will project forward. It's a slightly different point, your one about how our costs relate to the interest income that we're getting, because as your colleague was saying, that was set at a flat rate of 2%. So we need to be able to do both, if you see what I mean, work out what we think our costs will be, because we can't simply choose not to oversee this loan book properly just because of the cost, but we need to make sure we can model it, and then we'll be talking to the Treasury about how we get the right level of cost cover from them.
You haven't done it yet?
No.
Okay. Do you think there would be a point at which it becomes more cost effective to make these loans grants? And how will you know? What will be the factors that will...
I think this is part of the strategic options work that we want to do, which is thinking about different scenarios. As your colleagues have said, obviously one scenario is we continue to manage it, we become more efficient, also the loan book will be less time consuming, and therefore the fixed costs and variable costs will go down over time, and we can compare that with the expected income, which each year will change based on our latest view of the borrowers, because only some of those factors are in our control. Clearly, if we had a variable interest rate, a different flavour of loan book, we might have had more capacity to do different things, but we actually have relatively fixed parameters in this case. We know what the interest income will be. We can then overlay our expected scenarios in relation to those borrowers, and we will have, I think, a good ability to estimate our own costs going forward now that we've started to have a proper track record.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
See, what worries me, Permanent Secretary, is that I think you're getting into a period where the costs are going to go up because people are not going to default or going to default on their first payments. There will be negotiations with them, no doubt. Maybe they want to change the basis of the loan, the repayments and so on, and therefore your costs might go up. Now, is there a scenario, as Ms Olney has hinted at, where the actual interest you get in, it doesn't pay for the costs of running the whole thing?
I think there's always what I would call downside scenarios, as you describe, where our costs go up and the kind of fixed interest income doesn't offset them. So obviously when we look at our scenario work, we do need to look at that. I would say, just to kind of calibrate your concerns, we have spent a lot of time with the loan agents and they with the borrowers, and I think because of the interest payment holidays, actually we have a really good sense of where the borrowers are, because they've known for some time, you know, some of them up to 4 years, that this is the year where they would start to have to repay. So I think we do have a fairly good sense of where they are, and we know from our risk reporting what they are likely to do. Of course, I would never rule it out, and you know, I know from commercial situations, as you do, that sometimes unexpected things happen. There could be another cost of living crisis, there could be, God forbid, another pandemic. So you can never rule that out. But I think the most sensible thing for us to do is, on the basis of a solid track record that we will have from this year, to then do that scenario work. And of course, we'd be more than happy to come back and talk to you about it when we've done it. Is there anything you want to add, Nicola? Or Polly?
I think the only thing I would add is sort of to your point about what might drive our costs. Actually, what we are seeing is sort of managing those very limited number of cases where a borrower may seek a reprofile is actually sort of quite a small sort of proportion of the work that we are doing in casework within the team. So actually there are an awful lot of sort of what is kind of relatively stable, and we expect to be quite stable, is much more routine consent matters, much more routine sort of monitoring and reporting. So actually, although more borrowers coming into repayment is an inflection point and it does drive risk, and we will monitor whether it is driving increased sort of cases and costs, actually sort of by far the majority of the work is sort of irrespective of whether borrowers are in repayment, is what we have seen over this period.
I suppose the benchmark of all benchmarks, if you look at paragraph 18 in the NA report on page 12, is an outright sale of the loan book. And that wasn't one of the scenarios that you mentioned, Permanent Secretary, but really the whole raison d'etre for you continuing to manage it is if you actually sold it off and you got a sum of money earlier than you would otherwise expect to do, and the Treasury did all their calculations in the interest of value for money for the public purse, that is the benchmark you always ought to keep in mind, isn't it?
I mean, I'm keen when we do our strategic options to look at as many scenarios as we can think of, and obviously to the point earlier, interest rates have moved quite materially from where they were at the time these loans were given out, with a broadly fixed 2% interest rate. So there obviously is a sort of different backdrop that we're assessing it in, and absolutely we would look at a sale of the book amongst other things. I suppose it's worth saying, and I am in no way an expert on this, but things like student loans and some of the other loan books in government, there've often been all sorts of thoughts about what one might do. It can sometimes be quite hard to do in practice, and this is quite an unusual closed loan book. But absolutely, if there was a way in which a third party could find value from it in a way we couldn't, that could be a sensible thing to do, and we wouldn't rule it out. We have no sort of particular desire to stay here until 2045.
Well, the financial institutions are doing this all the time. They're assessing their loan books often in many thousands of loans rather than 120.
Absolutely.
So it's a relatively simple thing to do.
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth saying that in 2021 into 22, PwC gave us advice on all our options, which was behind when we decided that the way we were going to manage the loan book was with our loan agents and our LMS. And one of the options they looked at was sale. And in the business case in 2022 that was agreed both by our Finance Committee and the Treasury, there was a cost-benefit analysis done of various options, including the sale of the loan book at that point. Now, Susannah's completely right. When we do our strategic analysis next year, we'll revisit that and look at it again. But
sorry to interrupt, Ms. Payne. In that previous analysis, did you get an indicative price of what somebody would pay you for an outright sale? Because otherwise, how did you do the evaluation properly?
Gosh, you're testing my memory of the years ago. We must have, yes, but I think it was very much a range and very indicative.
Charteris.
Thank you very much. So would you be willing to make a commitment to the committee that all remaining borrowers, because some have been made insolvent, all remaining borrowers will have made their first repayment by September 2025?
That is our current expectation, yes. Obviously, some have already repaid ahead of schedule.
So would you put therefore on record to the committee that you are not willing to extend any more repayment holidays?
No, I don't think that would be a particularly sensible thing for me to say. My central assumption is, and as the NAO report says, we expect that all of the borrowers who are not already repaying will be repaying this financial year. And as you know, we have two repayment moments, March and September. So that is our current assumption. Obviously, if something happened that I can't currently predict between now and September, maybe that assumption wouldn't hold. So I'm not sure it's particularly helpful to the committee, but I will say it's my central assumption.
It's worth saying also that it may be that giving a repayment holiday actually maximises the financial return in the long term, the kind of situation, I mean, again, hypothetical that I was talking about before, that if you had a borrower who had, a particular issue in the very short term, but the analysis showed that there was a good long-term future, it might be better to give them a little breathing space or a little ability to make an investment such that they could make a commercial return. So that would be the kind of situation where it might be best to give a little bit of an extra holiday.
I think in that there is no doubt that, of course, any private sector organisation, a commercial organisation managing their own book would need to issue repayment holidays to maximise a commercial return. But I think this committee, as you've gathered, is concerned that ultimately there is a softening of the loan book here, that there is an extending of payment terms in ad infinitum going on, or that there may be more favourable renegotiations on the repayment of the loans. There's got to be a final line in the sand in which, as in your own words, you turn and you move past that inflection point. So just to give you the kind of another opportunity, is there a line in the sand where you say, that's it, we are not going to reflect any further on these repayment terms or repayment holidays?
I mean, I think it's really important, as they do today, that all of our borrowers understand their obligations to us and our expectations that they will repay when their repayment holiday ends. And that is the central assumption. So that's absolutely where I am.
And to reassure the committee, it might be worth saying that so far, less than 5% of borrowers have been granted reprofiles of their repayment. I'm not going to go into exact number because I don't want to, because it gets into such small numbers that people can start trying to.
I guess coming from a private sector organisation, what one would generally expect is September 2025 is the date in which many are expected to start repaying, that actually you get a call in August time at thelastminute.com, and there at that point they come back again to extend their payment holidays. And just could you use this as a vehicle, as a deterrent effect to those borrowers that you're not going to budge, this is going to end, and you're going to start recouping this for the taxpayers?
Absolutely, and I think it is one of the things that the NAO highlight. There's always a risk of sort of borrower advocacy, of people thinking that something will happen because every individual organisation thinks they're important for X, Y and Z reasons. But from the perspective of DCMS and this loan book, that is our central intention.
Yeah, that's great. And then just moving on to insolvency, as the NAO report has sort of drawn out, I think paragraph 2.20, DCMS expected 5% of borrowers to fail in the first 3 to 5 years, up to 4 to 9% failing by 10 years. And then 2.21, this 46.1 million to 9 borrowers had become insolvent, which is almost 10% of the 474 loans. So we're actually already there by your own assumptions. So you underestimated the volume of insolvencies, really, didn't you?
Well, I think in the original business case we said 5% in 3 years and up to 14% in 10 years, and we're at 7.5%. This is by number, so
Sorry, by value, I think it's critical in terms of taxpayer money, isn't it?
It's by number.
Yeah. So I think we, to some extent, as colleagues have said, the situation that have meant some borrowers in this book have gone insolvent, have been outside control. So we're recording the fact of where we are.
I was just looking for an acknowledgement that you underestimated at the time the value of insolvency in the loan book, which is now a tautological fact.
I think it's worth saying that you're right, it was 46.1, which is around 10%. However, we have recouped 10.1 million of that, 46.1 million, so that will be less than 10%. And on top of that, we expect to recover a further 7.3 to 11.1 million because we're still going through proceedings. So while I think that that 10% is starker than the reality.
And then the final thing I would add is I think, the business case did talk about percentage of borrowers. I think the variability in the size of loan within our portfolio is quite significant. So I think that is why we chose to talk about the percentage of borrowers, because predicting the value of sort of the percentage of the value of the loan book is much more difficult because it is so variable by which borrowers have those moments. But
therein politely rests with my hypothesis that really when it came to at least forecasting insolvency, DCMS at the time didn't have the skills in the department to properly outline good estimates.
I don't know if you can conclude it is because of that, or if also it's because there were a lot of exogenous and other factors. And even though we did have reasonable financial due diligence on each of these borrowers at the time, and I think more than some other government lending schemes did, it is always a complicated thing. So I'm not sure if it was just DCMS and its advisors' capability, but I understand your point that you think that if third-party commercial organisations were running this loan book, it might be different. I suppose set against that is the insights that we have on these borrowers from Sport England and Arts Council England as loan agents has, I think, been really invaluable in helping us to understand them, perhaps more than if it was a High Street Bank or insert commercial entity here. They might find it even harder. And one of the things that I've observed is that, for example, in the expected credit loss model, when it's an accounting standards thing, which obviously the NAO know all about, but even trying to get credit ratings for some of these organisations is actually very, very hard. So it might well be that the qualitative overlay that Arts Council England and Sport England can give us actually is of real value in this instance, just as a counter perspective.
Now I'll just turn in my final questions, if I may, Chair, to fraud, and this is noted at 2.22, page 41 of the NAO report.
Yep.
Really to invite you to, as the department, give an update on the 2 identified possible incidents of fraud, up to sort of £2.2 million, and to invite you, if there has been fraud in the loan book, would you apologise to our taxpayers as MPs on this committee?
I think it's always something that is, you know, speaking for myself, I think any accounting officer, when you're giving out grants or loans or any other form of money, you're deeply, deeply concerned about fraud, and I greatly regret if there has ever been any loss to the taxpayer because of fraud. As you will know from the evaluation, in fact, the fraud in these schemes has been relatively low, but we are in no way complacent. And Nicola, I'm sure, will want to talk to that small number of cases and the two.
Just zoom in on that one. You think it's been low because just in terms of the size of the loan book, I would think that's probably quite high compared to the private sector.
I suppose I was thinking in terms of COVID loans, and if you look at, for example, the bounce back loan scheme, which I know was a different nature of scheme, it was given out very fast, much higher volume, but I think the sample-based evidence of fraud was considerably higher. But as you say, any pound of fraud or error is something that I deeply regret and I'm sorry about. So absolutely, it's something that we're very focused on, and I think with Sport England and those 2 cases, Nicola, there's a lot of active focus, isn't there?
Yeah.
And it's just perplexing for me, given a moment ago, Permanent Secretary, you were sort of preaching the benefits of those close relationships that you have with some of these larger organisations, and therefore it's even slightly more bewildering that such fraud was uncovered, given that you have, in your own words, those levels of relationships with those organisations.
Well, I don't know if you want to talk about any of the specifics, but I suppose we think of fraud and error under one category. So it might be that because they are unfamiliar borrowers, I'm talking conceptually here, not specifically, that, for example, they could make a technical error about onward granting a piece of security that has already been granted to us as security. It isn't necessarily the case that a third party who said they were one party entered into the agreement with us turned out to be somebody else. But I don't know if there's anything you want to say, Nicola, about the specifics.
I mean, it's difficult for me to get any more specific than the Permanent Secretary has sort of outlined, really. But yes, exactly that. I think this is about sort of, I think we are, you know, these have not been instances of sort of, as far as we can tell at this stage, the original loan being obtained on a fraudulent basis. It has been other issues and events that have happened since.
And we also did do a fraud risk assessment in 2020, and then we have updated that. And more generally across the department, it won't surprise you to know that fraud is something that I'm always very concerned about, and we have been doing a lot of work, including with Arts Council England and Sport England, on upskilling their own fraud capabilities, because obviously we do give a lot of money as grants. So you're absolutely right to highlight it as an area that we remain very vigilant about.
You're working with the Public Sector Fraud Authority.
Absolutely.
At the moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just for the record, that same paragraph that Mr. Charteris very kindly drew the committee's attention to, 22 on page 41, it said you would split the assessments, fraud risk assessments, into 2. One was due to report in October 24 and one in December 24. Are those now all complete? And if so, do they show anything that this committee should be concerned about?
I don't think they've shown anything particularly different from what we had before, have they, Nicola?
No, they have. We've worked really closely with the Public Sector Fraud Authority to produce those updated assessments. The sport survival package is in place and is complete. The one on the CRF is in the final sort of stages of being complete. They have sort of identified, I suppose, and sought to get agreement with the input of the PSFA on sort of the particular areas that we think are now in this sort of post-event, post-award stage of most risk, and have sought to get agreement about sort of are our mitigations around those risks sort of appropriate, proportionate, etc. And as I understand it, on the one that we have agreed on the SSP, that, you know, we have reached a good place where we sort of feel clarity about the main areas of risk and our main areas of mitigation, and so yeah, that's what we are just finalising on the CRF side.
When do you expect that to be finalised?
I think I don't have a date for that, but as soon as possible. We are in the very final stages, so I would hope in the next month or 2.
If
but we can come back to you.
Anything untoward, would you update the committee?
Absolutely.
That would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Hewer, why has it been so difficult to get a memorandum of understanding agreed between you and Arts Council England for the collection of the loans?
So I would say two things by way of starting on this, and then others may wish to add. I mean, the first I would say is that throughout the time that they have been acting as our loan agent, they have been operating under an administration agreement, so there has been an agreement in place to govern that work. And the second thing I would say is that we are pleased that we have now signed that MOU, and that is in place. I think it is fair to say that, it has been about where our collective focus has been at certain points of the process. So we have been working very closely with loan agents and with Arts Council England, but it was really just that it did take us longer to just sort of codify those relationships into a written document than I think certainly we wanted.
What were the specific challenges around that?
We were developing with both loan agents an overview of our sort of service level expectations and sort of key performance indicators, and some of that took time for us to develop and iterate as to where we wanted those to be and to focus. But there weren't particular sort of obstacles. I think it was, if I'm honest, again, just one of those areas that in sort of looking back, we didn't sort of pay enough attention to the codification and the writing down of what we were doing, and would have sought to do that earlier. But we are pleased that it is now in place.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah Olney. Clive Betts, please.
You described to us how you thought the arrangement with the Arts Council and Sports England was the right one because they understood the organisations who were going to receive the loans, and that was the best way to manage this process. Yet at some point you probably thought, no, it's not working as well as we imagined. We therefore need a managed service provider. Why that change of heart?
Well, I think the NAO report sets out the chronology helpfully. At the beginning, it was about meeting the objectives, getting the money out to the third party. Then, as my colleagues have said, what we sought to do was bring the loan book together and run it in as orderly way as we can, given the original objectives and where we are now. And the managed service provider and the loan management system, in effect, gives us this interface which is so helpful with the data and analytics. The borrowers can put their information in and get certain information back. The loan agents can also use that system, and we also as well. So it was a hybrid approach that PwC originally recommended that we went with, and then over time what we've sought to do is make sure it's as clear as possible about what the department does, what the managed service provider does, and then what the loan agents do, and of course underneath that what the borrowers do. So I think it evolved over time, but I do think the loan management system is incredibly useful, and that's one of the reasons why we extended its scope, which, as the NAO points out, is one of the reasons why we did actually miss one of our own deadlines from the original business case, and that was one of those difficult choices. But to not extend the scope when we thought it was the right thing to do, I think would have been the wrong choice. So even though it meant we missed a deadline, it was the right thing to do.
You need additional specialist help.
It was really about the system, wasn't it? Trying to make sure it had the right functionality. At the time, at the beginning, we did need additional specialist help, which was why we had PwC both on options analysis and then helping us with the way that we approached this loan book.
So did you conclude you needed additional specialist help then?
Yes.
Right, but PwC are not a specialist in loan management, are they?
Well, PwC, I think, across the group do a lot of different things, including probably some loans, but we were engaging them originally as a professional service provider, giving us some assistance on the overall process that we found ourselves in 2020 of seeking to provide these loans and then work out how best to manage it.
That sounds a bit cosy. They're helping you design the system, and then, you're the ones we're going to give you some more work to actually help manage it.
Well, I think at the time each thing went through its stage, and when we did the procurement, they did win at that point, but in the future it could well be somebody else.
So how is the procurement done?
You mean in the future, or
with PwC? How will they How was the procurement done for them to actually provide this service?
Well, I think they gave us the original advice on the different ways of running this scheme, and then when we came to do the loan management system, there was an open procurement, and they were the winning party.
So they devised a scheme that they then tendered for.
I mean, I don't think it was exactly that simple in the sense that other people also could have bid for it. So obviously anybody who was the winning bidder would have to meet the required criteria.
So what has been achieved by this involvement of PwC, apart from apparently improving some consistency across the loan book? But I mean, is that all? Has it even achieved that?
Well, I think the loan management system on which all of the data and interface between the different parties, as I've just described, rests, has been brought together by PwC. So I think during the period, they've actually provided a helpful service. You might want to give some day-to-day colour on it, Nicola.
You do accept they're not specialists in this business?
We are not using them as a loan provider. We use them as a professional services provider.
Yeah, there are organisations who are expert in managing this situation where you're trying to recover, get payback of loans. There are specialists in this area. PwC's got no specialism, has it?
I mean, I think, as I've tried to describe, the process has gone through a number of phases. And at the beginning, when we were in setup, they were giving us professional services advice. And then
now,
they bid for...
now.
They bid for the pulling together and establishment of the loan management system. So it's a technical role for this data system, if I can call it that, which enables the borrowers to upload their financial information and see certain information. It enables the loan agents to get certain automated services, for example, on interest rates or so on. And it enables my team, and I'm simplifying, but to see trend analysis. So in effect, what they were doing was that technical pulling together of that system, and I think they did have the right expertise to do that. But as I say, in the future, it's perfectly possible that we could procure a different party to provide that system, and that's the way it's been set up. So their contract will run out, and then we could get a different third party.
So all this expertise they've got, after they've been appointed, spreadsheets were still being used by the loan agents to cobble together the information. So you've paid for this system, it went up in price about 50%, and it didn't work.
The way I would describe it is that in the beginning, in COVID, as in so many situations, the loan agents, I think, were using, or certainly Arts Council England was using spreadsheets. Sport England had a sort of formative loan management system, some kind of software solution. Then PwC integrated that, and that became our loan management system. Until that went live in its new scope that met our criteria in 2024, there were still some spreadsheets being used, and that is not unusual. It's obviously much better now we have got this system. And I think the thing to just be clear about is, as the NAO say, at no point did it affect the money that we were getting in or the underlying processes working. It's obviously better to have the system, and that's what we've now got. But yes, it did evolve, and then in June 24, the loan management system went live.
But the two loan agents you had, do you think you might have expected them to be able to do a relatively simple system like this to arrange for information about what had been paid, when it should be paid? Because even just to be able to see, answer that, please.
Yeah, I mean, each of the loan agents in the beginning, like us, was responding quickly to the situation in COVID and making sure they hit the key parameters. Neither of the loan agents at the time, I think, had a loan management system that was suitable for the whole loan book when brought together. So what PwC were doing was bringing together the Sport England system and overlaying the additional functionality that the department wanted.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I've got lots of people bidding. I'm going to get Nestle in first, if I can, please. Nestle.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I just thank the the panel for their contributions and answers.
And I just
so
must
far.
apologise to our witnesses. This musical accompaniment is not anything to do with the quality or otherwise of your answers. It's to do with the farmers protesting on their tractors.
Please say if you can't hear us.
Yeah.
I had nothing to do with it.
It's just an addition to the sound in the room. Thank you very much to the panellists for your answers so far. I just want to probe a bit more about the relationship with PwC, if I may, because it was in February 2023 that DCMS appointed PwC to develop the data collection, as you've outlined, and it was for a sort of storage solution of the loan management. And then during that, what proceeded, so over 2023, you decided to increase the scope of the work of the PwC. It isn't unheard of for PwC to come back and say, scope needs to increase, can you give us more money, which is precisely what happened. And any other aspect of the private sector or public sector will tell you tight contract management is crucial when you're working with PwC or others, so that there isn't this sort of mission creep or scope expansion. And that scope expansion cost the taxpayer an additional almost £1 million, didn't it?
Yes. First thing to say is, in a previous career before I was in the civil service, I worked in an investment bank as a professional service provider, so I absolutely agree with your healthy scepticism of why a third party might be asking or saying they need something or the costs need to be carefully scrutinised, and that's the mindset that we brought to this. I think it is worth saying that we increased the scope and therefore the time became longer and the cost went up. So I don't think it is just that PwC said, oh, increase the scope. I think as we got our track record of understanding this loan book from the standing start in 2020, we wanted greater functionality. And my understanding is, but Nicola might want to add, that actually that functionality is integral to our ability to manage this book in as professional a way as we can. So yes, you're right that it was increased, but I think we were active in asking for that greater scope, which then cost more money and took more time. It wasn't just PwC.
That's point. So you went with PwC knowing that they are consultants and they aren't experts in this field. And I understand the point that as things progress, as senior officials, you may want the scope of the work to widen. But isn't it reasonable that you could have anticipated that the scope of that work would widen, and therefore an initial decision should have been to not go with PwC, who are just consultants, and actually seek experts in the field?
I think it is the case that when we look at business cases, there are often optimism biases, and we try and challenge for that as they go through our finance committee, and this one obviously went through all its stages, and I'm sure my colleagues at the time were scrutinising for those kind of things, and we have acknowledged, as the NAO has, that there was some optimism bias here on the timeline and ultimately the scope. So I'm sort of neither agreeing nor disagreeing with you. I think it is one of those things you have to watch for. I think we were cautious and thoughtful in the way we did it, but in the end it did take longer and we did expand the scope.
You're comfortable with the additional £1 million it cost?
Yes, I am, because I think that was for the increased scope. Obviously, as we've said earlier, in response to your colleagues, going forward, what we want to make sure is that now that these fixed costs have been implemented, we can manage as efficiently as possible and hopefully over time bring the costs of this book down, because we have this system. It should actually bring some, not only some efficiencies, but also some data analytics benefits to us because of its scope, and we're very keen to see that trend data over time and see the way in which the system can be used to our benefit.
I ask if you're comfortable with that additional cost, because when the loan management system was launched in June 2024, it didn't go well. There were still, for example, borrowers who were reporting that they weren't able to log on to the platform. The Arts Council reported that the loan management system didn't provide a certain functionality. Some of this is detailed in the report.
It is, yeah.
For instance, it didn't even recalculate borrowing interest payments, which is quite a basic function. £1 million extra is quite a lot of money to then have something launched for it not to work.
I mean, I think, unfortunately, it is sometimes the case when these new systems are launched that there is a kind of learning and testing period, and I think that's what happened, and it's helpful that the NAO have set that out. And obviously, what we want to make sure is now the system is running, and the borrowers are more familiar with it and it is functioning, that we minimise those kind of things.
And just finally, Chair, so obviously hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I think you've very helpfully outlined why the decision to go with the PwC from the department's perspective was the right one at the time. And then as the scope widened, and it was much of an iterative process, you increased the contractual spend, and we are where we are.
Yeah.
Do you think it would have been better to go with a organisation that had specialism from the beginning? This isn't me saying you should have rowed back on the £2 million commitment from PwC, because that maybe would have been a complete waste of money. But upon reflection, is there something that DCMS or other departments should think about so that money is spent better from the very beginning, and then we don't have this creep mission?
I mean, obviously, you know, I think in all of these major programmes, one would always want that you don't have the optimism bias, you don't have the mission creep, you do get to the right outcome as soon as possible. I suppose the thing that I've been keen to ensure, and we have tried to be very reflective and still will be in this programme, but the thing we've been trying to ensure is for its particular features that we have the right team, capacity, capability and functionality in this system. And I'm not sure there would have been a bespoke off-the-shelf loan management system for this loan book, but obviously now that we've got it and the taxpayer has spent the cost of getting it, one of the things we want to make sure is, you know, in these strategic options, if there's a way to leverage that fixed cost better, that we do it.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lloyd.
Thank you, Chair. And if I may, I'd like to build on the line of questioning taken by my two colleagues to my left. Would you view it as good practice that the timing for setting up the loan management system did move? Now, I appreciate that the scope widened, but do you think it's a success story for the department that it moved from March 2023 to September 2023, then all the way to June of last year?
Certainly wouldn't describe it as a success for the department. I would say it was a sort of lived reality of this programme, both as we tackled some optimism bias probably in the initial business case and also as we changed the scope. So in a way, these things are always regrettable, and you know, my preference always would be that the business case exactly predicted what should happen, and it didn't in this case. So it definitely wasn't a success, but I think it was the right decision to expand the scope given the learning from this programme when we got to that point.
And again, I suppose, given that there was more than a year delayed, what lessons have been learned, considering that when it did go live, as Nicola has pointed out, there were a number of issues with the system once it went live?
I think what we've tried to do throughout this programme is make sure we're looking at lessons from as many perspectives as possible, and I know that the programme board has taken a number of lessons learned exercising with all parties so that we can try and internalise that. I suppose my lesson is when we look at that particular business case, we need to make sure going forward, as we are trying to predict the fixed costs of running this scheme vis-a-vis the income that it will get, but also the capability that we need, that we think forward, as this committee has said, about all possible scenarios in a wide sense. So we will be reflective on that, absolutely. I do think the most difficult technical part of this process was that loan management system.
And again, with this system, reading the NAO report, my main concern was that some time on, it's still not really clear who is ultimately responsible for its day-to-day operations. Of course, it's with PwC, but parts of this work are being replicated by Arts Council England or by Sport England, with this sort of them keeping their own spreadsheet. So I suppose responsibility does sit with PwC, but do you not see it as very counterproductive that you've got two other bodies also carrying out some of the work when it comes to running a loan management system?
I think we have sought to be as clear as possible, and as Nicola has said, as SRO, she's been keen to codify things about exactly who is doing what so that we minimise or eliminate any duplication. In terms of the system, my understanding was some of the spreadsheet keeping was when the system itself wasn't fully functioning and or operational, but now that it is, there shouldn't be that kind of duplication.
So are you confident that the SROs are happy that PwC are in charge when it is working, and that these other bodies like the Arts Council, like Sport England, are picking up the slack when the system fails. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not. I mean, the SRO is here, so you can ask her how confident she feels. So what I'm saying is, and it's set out in the NAO's report, each party in this loan book management has specific responsibilities. So the loan agents are undertaking the interface with the borrowers and so on. They get some of that information and it goes straight into the system. PwC's role is to manage the system until such point as potentially a new procurement happens and then another third party manages it. So I think it is clear, but Nicola, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I would add that sort of around the loan management system, I think we are now moving towards a place where, part of what we are doing through this phase is building that confidence in that being the single version of the truth so that all parties can rely upon it, so that we will remove those sort of need for local records and duplication.
May I just add just on that point, if you don't mind, Lloyd, because the NOI report talks about further improvements in functionality. So presumably it's still not fully functioning in the way that you would like.
So we took the decision that in order to get it to go live in June, that we should sort of agree, which we did with our loan agents, what were the most essential functionalities and get on and deliver version 1. And then there have been an agreed set of additional functionalities that are in version 2, which is due to be delivered.
Sorry, there have been no improvements since June 2024. There have been no further improvements.
No, sorry, I was just about to say we are in the process of implementing that second version.
Okay, and I ask that because the report says that as of the start of December 24, that work is yet to be agreed, which is, I think, what
it has now been agreed.
It has now been agreed,
and it is underway.
Led by PwC. Has there been a further cost to that?
There has been a small additional further cost for that further functionality.
How much?
300,000. But the loan management system itself, will still in mind.
Just to be clear, I mean, that's the point that I was trying to get at, is if this system has not been operational for most of its lifetime, or fully operational, I should say, and there has been flaws in it, when are other bodies like the Arts Council or Sports England actually picking up the slack, or indeed the department of a system that is not actually working all the time? And what is the additional cost of that if there is this duplication of work?
So I don't think that I would characterise it currently in version 1 as flawed and not working. There are additional functionalities that we are adding, like the ability to sort of...
The report does say there are flaws. The report does quite clearly stress that there are things that borrowers couldn't get access to.
Yeah, and those were relatively short-lived periods, and those have been rectified.
Might add an extra £300,000 to avoid organisations from having to use spreadsheets is quite surprising, given it should have been part of the original scope.
So I'm sorry if I gave you the impression that was to avoid the use of spreadsheets. I think it will provide additional functionality on top around automatic reprofiling, the way that allocation of payments happen to interest versus capital first. We should already be in a place where we...
So it's beyond just rectifying issues, there was additional
functionality that we are...
Which is what the £300,000 additional is delivering.
Then looking ahead, are you confident that the loan management system will be able to cope as we see an increased number of borrowers start to make their first repayments?
Yes, I am confident. All borrowers, whether they were in repayment or not, have been, given opportunity to test the system now and to ensure that they are ready. We have sent out proactive comms to all of the borrowers about to come on stream in March, and we'll replicate that ahead of September. So we are now confident of that operation.
Okay. I think it's worth saying, and this is a 25-year loan book. So, and when we were looking at our loan management system and thinking about the different versions and the functionality and the scope, the thing we were really focused on at all points was having the fully functioning system in place by September 25, when all the repayments would come on track. And we had hoped to do it earlier, and yes, you're right, there was a delay, but that we did have that September 25 date very firmly in our heads, and we are very confident that we will have version 2 with all the upgrades done well before that date. And then you talked about the lifetime of this loan management system will, we think it will be a number of years. I mean, whether it will still be the same system in 2046 by the end of the loan book, I think we probably will have needed to do some upgrades by then, and who knows what AI will be able to do by then. But I'm confident we'll be using it for many years.
And then my last question, if there's time, Chair, is obviously the current contract with PwC is going to expire next month. What will you do to make sure that whatever contracting decision you make, you don't repeat the mistakes you've made so far, and that we do have good value for money? For money for the taxpayer? I think particularly building on the points that Nicola said, we had seen a little bit of sort of mission creep as PwC has got more and more money from the taxpayer, and yet not really delivered the best sort of service in return, as we've seen there have been mistakes. So how do we make sure that if we do make a decision to go with them in the future, they do actually provide good value for money and not a flawed system?
Well, a lesson we've definitely learned is that we didn't have DDAT, so digital data and technology expertise, embedded in our loans team, and we now do have that embedded. And I mean, that was partly probably because, Susannah was saying one of our learnings right at the beginning was that we probably had underestimated some of the capacity and capability, and that was probably one element of that. And it was also probably partly because I remember this painfully, we were going through machinery of government change in 2023, which was just when we needed that, and there was a lot of things that our poor DDAT team had to be doing. When you take a department and split it out, there's a lot of you can imagine digital and data requirements. So I think with hindsight, that is a lesson we have learned, and we have now got that DDAT capability embedded in the team, and I think that will be really helpful for the future.
Also, I think every time you do a procurement the second time around, you have extraordinary, useful and very current learning. So rest assured, we will be bringing those to that when we do it.
Thank you.
So often with government projects, they are dynamic, they evolve over time. And we've heard, just Mr. Lloyd has very clearly pointed out to us that the break clause is in a month's time. But as we so often hear in this committee, government departments of all sorts commission systems, but they don't retain the IP. So when it comes to retendering, they have an awful problem. Have you retained the IP on this loan management system?
Yes, and we've talked about that, haven't we, in our conversations? That was one of my first questions. So we have an ability to extend the current contract, I think, by up to 12 months. But obviously, when we re-procure, it may not go to the same party.
Fair enough. Now, of course, one of the things that they do, as the report makes very clear on page 32 on that table, figure 7, is they monitor borrowers for fraud and financial risk. So they should have been helping you with that fraud issue that we questioned you about earlier on. But I'm particularly interested in the financial risk, because what we need, what I would suggest you need, is very up-to-date and very accurate credit management risk. Who actually is responsible for the credit management risk? Is it the your loan? Who is responsible for it? Is it PwC, or is it the two loan bodies, Sport England and the Arts Council? Who actually has ultimate responsibility to report up to you, the department, on the latest situation on credit management risks?
So our loan agents maintain an overview of the risk of each borrower, and they report those to us. Those are updated generally twice a year. We use PwC to give us check and challenge on those ratings, but we then seek to make sure that all parties have agreed those sort of risk ratings.
I thought the whole basis of using Sport England and the Arts Council was that they talk to all these various borrowers on a regular basis, and they obtain the most up-to-date information. So are we getting two lots of people asking the borrowers for the same information?
No, one set of information is submitted onto the loan management system and is available to all parties. So it's one set of information, and that is analysed predominantly by our loan agents. PwC, as I say, will use a bit of check and challenge on those ratings, but ultimately we will look to our loan agents to give us that view as to the current risk rating of our borrowers. based on their financial information, but also what they know more broadly about both the borrower and the sector.
In my experience in financial analysis, it sometimes is a bit of quantitative analysis and sometimes an overlay of, all sorts of qualitative judgments. And so I think, as Nicola's saying, there'll be some quantitative things we get, but also sometimes it will come down to a qualitative set of views from the loan agent and the conversations that they've been having. And what we've tried to make sure through our risk matrices for the different types of oversight and ultimately decision making, should it come to it, is that we're getting the best information from all of those sources. And I do genuinely think, having spoken to both Arts Council England and Sport England, that they have been really trying to make sure they understand these borrowers and they're bringing us that qualitative information, because that is the insight that's so invaluable. And yeah.
Is that information regularly reported to your DCMS board?
So it will come to the programme board and then it will escalate up should it be needed to. Our DRC, which is our Delivery and Risk Committee, regularly looks at the loan book. That's part of its portfolio of projects that it is reporting on every single time it meets. The analysis or issues come to our board, our executive board, should it be needed if it hits a certain risk threshold or so on. But on things like the strategic analysis we've been talking about, that will definitely come to our executive board, because that will be a critical set of decisions that ultimately will go to ministers for their decision making.
I'm not quite getting from that answer what level of change in the loan management book would go from the risk management committee to the main board.
The main board of DCMS?
Yes.
I think it would depend on what the particular set of issues were. So regular reporting comes to the programme board, and then also there's regular reporting at the department's Delivery and Risk Committee, which is a subcommittee of my executive board. Then, if there was either a set of decisions, as Polly has described, that might go through to ministers, but reporting itself wouldn't routinely come to my board, except as looking at the DRC's portfolio.
And you personally, given that this is one of your bigger items in your whole management portfolio of the department, how quickly would you personally be appraised of a material change?
I mean, very, very quickly. One of the benefits of DCMS being a relatively small department is it's hard to find anything that doesn't come quickly if it needs to. So I feel very confident that if there was any issue outside the areas where I'm conflicted, I would know about them.
Just so we're absolutely clear, on the area where you are conflicted, the rugby area, which is one of the more difficult areas, which of your two colleagues ultimately takes decisions on that? Polly has indicated. Thank you very much.
We've divided it up so that I'm responsible for the decisions, but it was Sam Lister, our other DG, who is the DG responsible for the finance side, has an accounting officer hat on. So he's moved on. So he's currently he's being replaced. But whoever replaces him will be the person responsible for looking at the accounting officer assessment and doing that kind of double check. So I will be responsible for the basic decision
and in the meantime,
advice to ministers.
Our finance director is taking that role, so there is no gap, just to be clear.
Yes.
We've been very careful about that.
It's useful for the record. Thank you very much. Luke Charteris.
Thank you. May I return to our discussion previously around the future risks of the loan book and borrower insolvency forecasting? I think, would you share my view that, as I touched on previously, that you were slightly over-optimistic about borrower default rate? And sort of my secondary question, if we look at value or volume, when you were doing that initial modelling, were you looking at sort of the clubs on an individualised basis, or did you also do a wider analysis as to the sustainability of the sector and the sport itself? Because it's no good just looking at individual rugby premiership clubs, because they're all interconnected. So did you look at not only the individual financial sustainability assessments, but did you look at the sector as a whole when thinking about your insolvency projections?
Do you mind if Polly took that?
So in rugby, absolutely. We have, when we've been thinking about likely insolvencies and about the financial strength of the individual clubs, we have also thought about the financial situation of the Premier League, actually, in particular, as a whole. And we have been not only, and that sounds a bit passive, we've not only been taking account of it, we've also been using the government's convening power to try and help with the financial sustainability of that. So we appointed in 2023, in summer 2023, we appointed 2 consultants, Ralph Rimmer and Chris Pilling, who are experts, and they did, the department paid for them to do some work, and they worked with the RFU, with the Rugby Football Union, with the Rugby Premier League, with ourselves and with CVC, who own a significant proportion of the Premier Rugby League assets. And we got them to do a consultation. So we take this very seriously.
If you look at a recent independent report from the University of Portsmouth, they revealed that 7 Premiership rugby clubs are in the red. There's a concern about the overall financial sustainability of this. But I mean, did you get this right when you were modelling insolvency at the time? And given that 3 have already defaulted, can I use this as an opportunity to invite you to update your assumptions as to the likely projections you've got for insolvency across the loan book as a whole?
So there's almost 2 questions there. When we were giving the loans, I suppose we knew that we wanted to support rugby union. And I suppose the question, as we did other sports through COVID, very difficult time. So I suppose there were kind of 3 options, weren't there? There were to do nothing, which we wouldn't have wanted to do because we would have wanted to support. And then there was the, do you give them grant or loans? So I suppose the alternative would have been grant. And our judgment at that time was that they could repay, that it was reasonable to ask them to take on the burden of repayment. So that was the judgment at the time. More recently, yes, we obviously have been saddened to watch the troubles that they've been through. And, you know, we're talking about insolvencies of rugby clubs here, which are very important to, obviously, players, to fans and communities. So this is something we really care very deeply about. Not just, I mean, we care about getting our money back on the loan book, but there are much wider reasons for caring and for having for DCMS, for the government to have a role.
I suppose my question was around updating your forecast about, you know, whether there are going to be any more, you know, very sadly, insolvencies in the sector. We've had 3. We're already effectively veering on the sort of worst case scenario relative to your initial forecast. So are you optimistic or pessimistic about the propensity for more insolvencies in elite rugby?
So we are absolutely reviewing and updating our forecasts. And are we more or less pessimistic than we were at the time we gave the loans? I mean, I think everything that has gone on in the sport, I think we are probably more pessimistic than we were then. However, I'd like to point to the Professional Game Partnership, which was signed in September 24. It's an 8-year deal, and that was part of what came out of our consultants' work. So I think that made us more positive. So I think, you know, it changes, and we keep an eye on it, and we talk all the time to the clubs. So absolutely, we keep it under review, and we really, really care about it.
And do you think there are at least some clubs that do have a high risk of default?
It's such small numbers, I just wouldn't want to get into talking about our individual borrowers. We've got really strong confidentiality agreements with them, and it's such small numbers. If I said anything, I'm sure it would get speculated about.
We understand that.
Thank you.
I think we'll now transfer to Clive Betts, who has a series of questions on rugby. Thank you, Mr. Jeffers.
I think it was appropriate to give a quarter of the money that you had available to one sport, professional rugby union. It's professional. It's not, you know, some amateur sport which is desperately hard up. it's a professional game, wealthy benefactors, well-paid players, and you give a quarter of your money to them.
So I think that it's worth when the SSP board looked at what money was given out, they looked at everything on a case-by-case basis, and there were basically the same requirements on all applicants. So they had to be financially solvent before COVID. They had to be giving they had to be important for the sustainability of their sector, and to give them a loan, we had to think that they were able to repay a loan, and they had exhausted all other commercial support. So there wasn't that there was any special treatment, and we didn't think about it sport by sport. And I think it's worth saying that the envelope of spending we could have spent was underspent. So it wasn't that by giving more loans to, as you say, professional rugby union, that other sports, sorry, it's quite distracting, other sports lost out in any way. So if that was the concern.
Yes, are you saying that you looked initially about the position of the clubs you were lending to and the sport, see whether there were any financial problems? There were. Everyone knew rugby got financial problems. Weren't you effectively giving them money under the guise of COVID loans to help them through what were already serious financial difficulties?
Well, in order to get a loan, they had to be assessed to be financially solvent before COVID, and so that would have been the assessment.
It seems as though it was a very, very strong assessment, does it? Given that some clubs have basically gone over completely. Some large clubs, Wasps, for example, Worcester, they've fallen over without having paid a penny of the COVID loans back, haven't they?
But I think the assessment undertaken was that before COVID, so before March 2020, they were financially solvent.
You're saying that with a straight face to us now, are you?
Yes,
I think
I am.
A lot of people in the industry, in the business, in the media, will probably have a lot of questions about.
Well, that was the assessment of the board at the time, with its chair in Cheshire and representatives.
The board, which board? Sorry.
So the sports, the SSP had a board, and that board looked at all the loans.
Both the Cultural Recovery Fund and the Sports Survival Package in 2020 and 21 had the board, including external members who assessed the loans.
So rugby told you it was all okay to give rugby money?
I think it was more than that. I think all lenders had to give financial details, and those were assessed. They had expert assessments.
Well, it didn't take very long for them to fall over and all those assessments to be wrong, did it?
Unfortunately, within the next 3 years, yes, that is what happened.
You have to question, don't you? The information was given to you then, not your assessment of it.
Well, if if you're implying there was wrong or misinformation or fraudulent information, we'd obviously have
I'm
to
not
look
going
at
to
that.
use the word fraudulent. I'm just going to say inaccurate.
I have no reason to believe the information given at the time was inaccurate.
Right. And so now, in getting the money that is still owed repaid from the rugby clubs, are you taking a hard line? Again, it's a professional sport, large salaries, wealthy owners. Are you making sure they pay up what they owe you?
We're taking exactly the same test as we do with all our loans, which is that the financial objective is paramount. We will assess them against that. We will do whatever we need to do to get the maximum of taxpayers' money back, except if there was a policy objective, and then it would be a ministerial decision, and so far ministers have not made any of those decisions.
Right. Let's come on to what the other sport, which has clearly got some issues and problems, basketball.
Yep.
I'll just say that I've been approached by Sheffield Sharks, who are a basketball team. They're in my constituency. In fact, their new arena is just across the road from my office, so I see them operate. What they're saying is that the way the department has allowed the British Basketball Federation to basically franchise out the running of the league has now put at risk the loans that you're owed from some clubs. Indeed, I understand that Leicester and Newcastle may now be signalling that they're going to have difficulty repaying the loans because of the worsened financial situation in basketball. I've asked questions about this, but you seem quite content that this franchising out to people who have got no history of running a sport before is okay.
I know that you did ask a question, didn't you, to our Minister for Sport, Stephanie Peacock, and I think our position is the same as her answer at the time, which is it is a matter for the basketball governing body how they want to take forward these commercial decisions. There's a slightly separate point about the implication for the loan book.
Well, it's very important, given that's what we're talking about today. Given that basketball were proposing to do something fundamental to the running of their league, which could affect their finances, did you do any impact assessment on what that decision could mean for the repayment of the loans that you're owed?
I think, as I understand it, the commercial decision-making by the Basketball Federation is something they're doing at the moment. And as we've said, the financial objectives mean we will look at any borrowers, under the terms of their agreement with us. So they're slightly separate things. And it's not for us, the government, to intervene in their commercial decision-making. I don't know if there's anything about basketball you want to say.
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, any borrower who was to feel that they were unable to service their loan can approach their loan agent to discuss that, and we would expect that, Sport England certainly are, working very closely with the clubs to understand their latest view.
It doesn't feel like this is in the real world. The real world is that the government is owed money by organisations, clubs, which are part of a league, and the Basketball Federation, the governing body, is looking to franchise out the running of that league, which could affect the club's ability to pay you back your loans. Surely there is a connection there you've got to make.
I think in a way it's a sort of version of what we've been discussing before, that there's a set of issues, parameters, exogenous factors that will affect all of these sports at different times and in different ways. Some of those factors might be affected by legitimate commercial decisions made by the governing bodies. In this case, this is a set of decisions for that governing body. Separately, we need to consider the position of the borrower, but I don't think we can conflate the two things. And I think, as the Minister for Sport said, this is a commercial matter for that governing body.
Conflating the two things isn't the word I would use. I would have thought linking the two things might be a good idea.
Well, it may be in due course that the loan agents and or the team are looking at the specific position of some of the basketball borrowers, and there are factors that you've described that affect it. But I think our position in relation to the commercial decision-making of that governing body is it's for them to make.
Well, I just have two questions. So you might look at it afterwards. If the damage is done and the loans don't get repaid, you might then ask why they haven't been repaid, rather than looking in advance to stop a situation where they might not be repaid.
Yeah, I think, as we've said, the structures and processes we have and the risk-based way in which we approach it mean we should always have a line of sight to what is going on with an individual borrower. So if there were financial issues for any number of reasons, we should know about that. I don't think it's the same as saying that if we thought that a borrower had an issue because of a certain thing in a certain sector, the government should then cut across the commercial obligations of that national governing body.
Are you asking Sport England to do any oversight, any investigation, show any interest into this? Your agents in this, and you're employing them because they are the experts who know the sports and the clubs there.
In relation to basketball, I don't actually know what Sport England are doing in relation to basketball, but
I mean, they will continue to liaise with those particular borrowers in the normal way.
So have they been asked to do anything particular about this issue?
I think it's worth saying two things. Firstly, of the 11 clubs who had loans, 7 have repaid them in full. There are still 4 clubs left.
Including Sheffield Sharks, they've advised me as well, yes.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's also worth saying that, yes, Sport England do have a kind of ongoing relationship with British basketball, and indeed in November 24 there was additional funding given to British Basketball Federation, and that's both from UK Sport because of the Olympics coming up in LA, but also through Sport England. So there is an ongoing relationship, and they are interested, and they are interested without the loans, but we wouldn't want to do special treatment because of the loans.
Yeah, but of course then Sport England as an interested body, important body, surely have an interest in the governance of basketball to give it any money, don't they?
Well, Sport England give, as you'll know, money to nearly many of our...
but they normally take an interest in how the sports are governed.
I think absolutely they would be very unhappy if they weren't being governed according to the code.
So they're quite happy for a sport to be franchised out then? So
I think that I think there's clear roles that if the governance is not properly done in line with the code, that's a difficulty, but they would not get involved in very detailed commercial negotiations.
Okay, I think it might be helpful to have a note about exactly what is going on and what Sport England, as your agents in this and as an important body in your relationships with sport, thinks is happening here, and whether they have no interest at all in it at all. Give us
we can definitely come back to you with a bit more colour. I don't think we'll be able to get into the commercial situation.
It would be helpful to know whether you think that's important or not.
Ms. Payne, I want to ask you a very important question, and I don't mind if you don't answer it today, but I would like a really accurate answer. In relation to your earlier answer about knowing the financial status of rugby clubs before you gave the grant, I understand that CVC Capital Investment were giving 200 million to PRL clubs back in 2019 to keep clubs going in return for a 27% stake. So it seems that it was well out there that certain clubs were in financial difficulties well before COVID, and you were saying that you only gave them grants on the basis that you had information that they were solvent. The two things don't seem to be in total conflict with each other.
I think we need to write to you. My understanding was that the CVC investment was a commercial investment made to get returns as you'd expect from such a company. But before I go any further, I think we probably need to write to you on that.
If you could, because that's quite a serious matter. If they were already in financial trouble, to then go and give them another loan seems as if the due diligence wasn't done properly. But let's wait for your supply. I think Luke Charteris...
Just on the letter, may I, could you also include kind of what the metrics were for assessing financial viability?
At the time, absolutely. Absolutely.
We can do that.
That's a really
cash runway or whatever.
Really helpful
Yeah,
question.
very happy to do that. And we can also give information on who made the assessment.
Now, following on from that, and given that you are likely to have to look at some of these organisations that may well either default on their loans or go into insolvency, who actually is responsible for those negotiations?
This is the negotiations...
Well, if you either get news of or an organisation, and I'm not going to name one on the arts or the rugby side or the sports side, if you get information that suggests to you that they're either going to default on their loan agreements or, worse, that they're likely to go into insolvency, who actually carries out those negotiations on your behalf? It's
a combination of individuals from Sport England and from the department. So there have been discussions between individual clubs and DCMS officials, and that's for us to understand fully and to hear representations before any decisions are made.
Again, that answer worries me, because I can't imagine that either the department or Sport England would have sufficiently qualified insolvency and debt management practitioners. If anybody was going to do this, I'd expecting you to be telling me it was PwC insolvency experts who were going to do this.
Sorry, I should have clarified. The DCMS and Sport England with external advisors as required.
So who would the external advisors be? Would they be PwC or would they be an insolvency practitioner?
They could be PwC, they could also be, for instance, we have legal, we bring in lawyers where needed, especially to tell us about our rights, and we would bring in whatever other experts we needed.
And that has happened in the 9 cases of those organisations that have already gone into insolvency?
So I don't know exactly what experts were brought in with those cases, but we can
certainly
find.
I think it would be really helpful, both of you, if we could include in the note exactly how you are negotiating, who is negotiating, and what qualifications they've got with loan defaults and insolvencies.
I think we can give you some generic answers.
No,
I
I'm not
wouldn't
asking
want.
for
I don't want
specific
to talk about the particular.
No. I'm not asking for specific
And
cases.
obviously, the different individual cases have very different requirements depending on how much, because our loans range so much from a few.
Well, generically, these insolvency practitioners were involved in 3 out of those. We involved senior counsel in 4, whatever it happens.
We take the point, though. We take the point, and it's an important one, because I think what you're saying is if we find ourselves in these difficult situations, we need to make sure we've got the best professional expertise advising the taxpayer. So we absolutely take the point and happy to provide that colour, Chair.
Given that these things can happen very quickly, is there a mechanism to report them very quickly if you need to, on the distinction you've now made twice between strictly financial transactions and the need to change policy? Is there a mechanism to rapidly escalate that to ministers if necessary?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Does anybody have any more questions, or are we done? So it only remains for me to thank you very much. It's been quite a testing session. So can I thank our witnesses very much for attending. Uncorrected transcripts of our hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days. The committee will consider evidence provided from DCMS, the department today, and our witnesses, and produce a report with recommendations in due course. Order.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.